blood that you spilled for me, forever changed by your glory. You called me out into eternity. I'm wrecked by love, my fears are fleeting, seeing all you've done and how I'm yours. Keep me near the cross where your mercy found me free. For all who call, won't you bring us to the cross? Forever found, and you will keep me, touched by the tears that you shed for me. Lord, I will go where you are leading. Your shining light is all I see. I'm wrecked by love, my fears are fleeting, seeing all you've done and how I'm yours. I'm wrecked by love, my fears are fleeting, seeing all you've done and how I'm yours. Keep me near the cross where your mercy found me free. For all who call, won't you bring us to the cross? Won't you bring us to the cross? Won't you bring us to the cross? On the cross, your heart was fixed on us. All the lost, your heart was fixed on us. All alone, your heart was fixed on us, fixed on us. On the cross, your heart was fixed on us. All the lost, your heart was fixed on us. All alone, your heart was fixed on us, fixed on us. I'm wrecked by love, my fears are fleeting, seeing all you've done and how I'm yours. I'm wrecked by love, my fears are fleeting, seeing all you've done and how I'm yours. I'm wrecked by love, my fears are fleeting.
There's something about the gospel that changes you.
God is able to turn your mess into a powerful message.
Jesus is Lord. He's the boss of your life. He's the master.
Christ redeemed you. Christ bought you. You are qualified now.
Real love doesn't just talk, it demonstrates.
And now for today's message.
I recently had the privilege of preaching at Kings Park International Church in North Carolina. Pastor Reggie, when he invited me, told me they were doing a 6-week series on the book of Daniel, and I was assigned Daniel chapter 2. Well, I had preached countless sermons from Daniel 1, Daniel 3, 4, 5, 6, but I had never preached on Daniel 2. Digging into this text definitely forced me out of my comfort zone. What hit me hard from Daniel 2 was the way Daniel spoke truth to power. With his life on the line in that moment, I'm sure Daniel must have been tempted to speak flattery to power rather than truth. But not Daniel. He had this habit of speaking truth, no matter how unwelcome that truth may have been. Today I want to explore that idea that spiritual leaders are supposed to speak truth to power. Now that phrase seems to be popping up all over the place. Not just here in America, but I hear that idea in the Philippines. I've heard it in South Africa. I've heard it in Nigeria. I hear it all over the world, this idea of speaking truth to power. The phrase was popularized in the 1940s by Bayard Rustin. Most of you have never heard that name. Some of the Americans watching this video know him as the public intellectual who was behind the scenes as an activist for civil rights, gay rights, nonviolent resistance, and socialism. Rustin was the one who organized the Freedom Rides, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, but due to the controversy surrounding his sexuality and his past membership in the Communist Party, for most of his life he tended to work behind the scenes, functioning as a thought leader in the movements he supported. For example, Rustin served as an unidentified member of the team that wrote a book titled Speak Truth to Power, A Quaker Search for an Alternative to Violence. It was published in 1955 and became a very influential argument for pacifism in the United States, and it gave vocabulary to a generation that a decade later would protest the Vietnam War. Rustin wanted to keep his participation in this project, the Speak Truth to Power project, a secret, because he was convinced that his sexual orientation would be used as an excuse by critics to dismiss his whole argument. Remember, this was 70 years ago. Because there are so many, and even Christians, talking about the need today to speak truth to power, there are a lot of people looking for a Bible verse that mentions the idea. Let me help you with your search. Rustin admitted that he adapted the phrase speak truth to power from a quote that's attributed to Muhammad in the Hadith. Here's the exact quote, depending on your English translation. The most excellent jihad is when one speaks a true word in the presence of a tyrannical leader. Rustin took Muhammad's idea and shortened it to speak truth to power. With that phrase being out there, not just in America and not just on our campuses, but really it's all over the world more and more, I thought it would be important right now to see what, if anything, the Bible has to say about the concept. Now, it's important to note that while the phrase speaking truth to power is rooted in Muhammad's view of faith and society, and with a movement that's not really compatible with our faith, that fact doesn't mean that the idea is to be outright rejected. We reject or accept an idea based on the truth of that idea, not on who said it or who wrote it. But if we're going to speak truth to power, then we have to do it for a reason that's compatible with Scripture. We have to have a motive that's compatible with Scripture. We need a methodology that's compatible with Scripture. We have to look for outcomes that are compatible with Scripture. That brings us to Daniel chapter 2. Specifically, how did Daniel speak truth to power, and what was the outcome when this great spiritual leader spoke truth to power? We're going to go to the end of the story and then backtrack and fill in the gaps. This is a powerful ending to the story of Daniel speaking truth to power, beginning in verse 46. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and paid homage to Daniel, and commanded that an offering and incense be offered up to him. The king answered and said to Daniel, "Truly your God is God of gods and Lord of kings and revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery." Then the king gave Daniel high honors and many great gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. Daniel made a request of the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. Then Daniel remained at the king's court. King Nebuchadnezzar was the most powerful man in what was known at that time as the most powerful kingdom in the world. He was rich, he was evil, he was violent, he had all authority, and he had a dream that troubled his spirit. We see this phrase comes up twice in chapter 2. In verse 1 it says, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream and his spirit was troubled. Then again in verse 3 it says, the king said to them, I had a dream and my spirit was troubled. If you're a pastor, a campus missionary, a church planter, any kind of spiritual leader, don't miss this point. Listen to me on this one. It doesn't matter how much money a person has. It doesn't matter how much power, fame, authority, what kind of car they drive, or what kind of palatial house they might live in. There are a lot of rich, powerful, famous people today who are troubled in their spirits, just like King Nebuchadnezzar. And they are desperately searching for someone with answers. And that someone is you. King Nebuchadnezzar was so deeply troubled to the point that he couldn't sleep. There are a lot of people around you today. They seem successful on the outside, but inside they are deeply troubled. They are a troubled soul. That's one reason we need to learn how to speak truth, God's gospel truth, to the troubled souls who are in power. If not us, then who's going to do it? If not gospel truth, then what truth? If not now, when so many people are troubled, then when? Daniel spoke truth to power at a time when the person in power was deeply troubled and very open to truth. Whether they admit it or not, that's where many leaders are today, troubled in soul and open to truth. So now we want to go to chapter 2. Here's the story. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. That dream troubles his spirit. That dream terrifies him. You know what he does? Like any ungodly leader of his day, he issues a death threat. He becomes more unjust and more violent than before. He says, if someone can't figure this dream out, I'm going to kill a bunch of people. Of course, under that kind of pressure, none of his wise men are able to come up with an answer for Nebuchadnezzar. Eventually, his enforcers and his executioners make their way to Daniel. They threaten his life. Daniel's supposed to be this really, really smart, wise man. And they say, you're a dead man if you don't give the king the answer he wants. He's troubled. He has to have an answer. Now, this brings us to the first place in chapter 2 where Daniel speaks truth to power. This time it's not directly to Nebuchadnezzar, but it's to his leaders. It's to his associates who come there with this message. Daniel's life is on the line. It's unjust, it's unfair, Daniel's done nothing wrong. But this crazed leader, this troubled king who had this dream, this ungodly, violent king is threatening his life and a bunch of other people's lives if Daniel can't come up with the answer. But remember, none of them have done anything wrong. This is totally unjust. The text we read earlier started with this phrase, then King Nebuchadnezzar. I want to focus on that word then. Then King Nebuchadnezzar. You've probably never heard a sermon built around the word then, but it's mentioned 4 times in Daniel 2. After Daniel spoke truth to power, it says, then Nebuchadnezzar recognized and confessed the real God, then he spared Daniel's life. He promoted Daniel. He promoted Daniel's friends. Everything changed after truth was spoken to power. He stunned everyone who knew him with his sudden God talk. But there were 3 other mentions of then before that. Before we get to then Nebuchadnezzar, if you want the results of speaking the truth to power, if you want people in power to respond like Nebuchadnezzar did and turn from idols to the real God, then we have to look and see what Daniel did to get there. There's a dream, there's a death threat, a dream that troubles the king, a death threat that troubles everyone else. Verse 14, how did Daniel respond to this unjust death threat? He didn't tweet truth to power, some snarky response designed to impress his 200 followers. Look at verse 14. Here it is. Then Daniel replied. Now pay close attention to the next couple of ideas. Here we go. Then Daniel replied, it says, with prudence and discretion. This is how we're supposed to speak truth to power. That is, if we want to live to tell about it, and if we want power to actually listen to the truth we're speaking. Prudence and discretion. Other translations use wisdom and tact. Another one uses the word counsel. The starting point from a biblical perspective is to speak with prudence and discretion, wisdom and tact, counsel. That's how we speak truth if we want the results that Daniel had, if we want power to listen and turn to God. If that's not our goal, then maybe wisdom and tact are not necessary. But if at some level our goal is evangelistic ministry along with prophetic proclamation, and we want Daniel 2 results, then how we speak truth is as important as speaking truth. Verse 14, our first then Daniel was a public response. And the public response was done with wisdom and tact, with prudence, with discretion. In other words, before we give a public word, tweet, response, we need to pause, take a breath, and ask God for wisdom. It doesn't mean we stay silent, but a moment of silent prayer before reacting is probably a good move. I don't know about you, but my first impulse is usually not the best public response. The next then Daniel is in verse 17. Then Daniel went to his house. We saw his public response in verse 14. Now we see his private response in his house with his closest friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These are the same guys from chapter 1 who made each other 10 times better together. There's a public response, there's a private response. There are things that we say around our close friends when our life is on the line, when everything is falling apart, and there's a public response that's calm and marked by prudence and discretion. There's the get with your buddies and vent response. I can imagine Daniel with his 3 lifelong friends. They're talking, man, can you believe what happened? Can you believe our life's in jeopardy? What's wrong with that king? What are we going to do? I can imagine the conversation. It's not the same as the public response. There's always a private response that's different. A lot of people don't know the difference in public and private responses. In the misguided name of transparency, too many people put things out there on social media that should be processed privately with their spouse, with their close friends, but it shouldn't be out there in public. But there it is for all to see and to read and to think, whoa, who are you processing with? What were you thinking? Why are you making this public? This is not for public consumption. But too many people are confused because they want to be transparent. Leaders, listen to me. Teach your upcoming leaders that they don't need to be transparent in every situation all the time, especially in public, on social media, and in the pulpit. They need to have a private life for their sake and for the sake of those who they love. Having a private life does not equate to hypocrisy. Just because you don't air everything on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook or whatever, it doesn't mean you're not authentic. It just means you have prudence and discretion and wisdom. It means you know the difference in public and private. Daniel had a public response to power, and he had a private response. Spiritual leaders need a private world with close friends that we do life with. Who are those people in your life? Who is your Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Who are those people that you can be completely transparent and honest when the pressure hits? I trust you have people like that in your life. Now we see the final then Daniel. His final response after his public response and his private response. Verse 19. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. As surely as there's a public response and a private response, there has to be a praise response. Daniel's life was on the line. It was an unjust situation. He was being persecuted for doing nothing wrong. It was horrible. But he needed a miracle from God. He didn't have it yet. But you know what? No matter how bad it was, no matter what the situation, it still demanded a praise response. Even before the king has turned, somehow we see Daniel turning this public response, private response, into a praise response. When you speak truth to power, make sure you follow up whatever you do with this moment, this season with God of praise and prayer, even before you see the answer, even before you see the results. Notice specifically the content of Daniel's praise response. Beginning in verse 20, it says, Daniel answered and said, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever." Boy, that's always a good response. Then it says this, "To whom belong wisdom and might." Now, Daniel didn't have that wisdom yet, but he's believing God. Look at verse 21. Speaking of God, it said, He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. Do you believe that? The praise response is about the sovereignty of God. It's not about the momentary situation. At some point, we stand there before God, we confess our faith, and we believe our God is sovereign no matter what. Our university campuses, our communities, our nation, the nations of the world desperately need people like Daniel who will speak truth to power. The world doesn't need a church that's silent and off in the corner just doing what the world would call just church things. No, our campuses and communities need spiritual leaders like you who will speak truth to power. And when it's spoken in public, it's truth that's wrapped in prudence and discretion and wisdom, not wrapped in arrogance and self-righteousness. And in private, that truth needs to be processed by seeking God with a godly community of friends. And finally, no matter what the results, we need to praise and acknowledge the sovereignty of God. When our goal of speaking truth to power is to honor God and to advance His kingdom, when our goal is to see those people in power, especially the oppressive, ungodly, violent, unjust people in power like Nebuchadnezzar, when our goal is to see them fall on their face before God, then with that as a goal, we are ready to speak truth to power. May God help each one of us know when to speak in public and when to speak in private. May He anoint us with a prophetic proclamation and an evangelistic heart as we speak truth to power. And finally, may we put our trust in the truth of Proverbs 21:1. The king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever He will. I believe God is going to turn the hearts of leaders as you speak truth to power with wisdom, with discretion, with prudence, and with boldness.